but from the standpoint of looking at the integrity of the process, they had grave concerns about it.
Meanwhile, in New York, a uniquely American process had started. The lawyers representing the Institut Pasteur did something they couldn't have done in France, and they certainly couldn't have done in Britain. They used the American Freedom of Information Act and requested copies of Gallo's team's lab notes for the period in question. The lab was obliged to hand the copies over. They were not obliged to give help in understanding them. The papers arrived in disarray, and it took a while to interpret them. But what they revealed eventually was of great interest. Gallo had claimed that he knew little of the sample he had been sent of bruise virus, known as LAV. Sometimes he said that the culture had died. But the notes tell a different story. There were numerous references to attempts to grow it since 1983. The notes are not in his hand, and with a large laboratory staff, he would not necessarily know the detail of all the experiments being done. In one instance, the lawyers had obtained 2 copies of the same letter, one from Gallo and one from another part of NIH. A comparison showed that references to LAV had been deleted from the other copy. An anonymous telephone caller also told the lawyers that the photograph of a virus in one of Gallo's key papers was, in fact, a picture of the French virus taken in his lab. Whether this occurred by accident, as Gallo claims, or by design, we do not know.
Clearly, they were trying to reproduce our results without telling a word. And that was a little shocking, I would say, because when you give some material to some people, you will expect they will give you some news about what they are going to do with it and what result they got.
We had the virus growing in Atlanta, but Bob said that he had never been able to grow it at NCI, so he really didn't have any. When people ask him, isn't this French virus, he would say, well, I really don't know because the virus they sent me was dead. In reality, everyone knows he was growing huge amounts of the virus.
He was incensed that there would be a question about his scientific integrity. He was furious with the French. As he sat in my office, he told me that the French were trying to steal away the Nobel Prize from him, and that even though there may be questions raised about the chain of custody of the virus and the procedures that were used, that those were all lies, and that he could attest to the fact that there was nothing done with the French virus, nothing. And he pounded the table when he did it.
The Department of Health had a number of questions they wanted answered in preparation for a possible legal battle. They told the NIH to conduct its own investigation. They did so, and produced a report which backed Dr. Gallo and the Department of Health's patent claim. The report was never published, but we do know that it missed a vital development that was beginning to emerge at that time. As scientists around the world began to study more and more examples of the viruses from different AIDS patients, they found that the virus was remarkably variable. Its genetic makeup changed radically from patient to patient, even from the same patient at different times. It was as if everyone with AIDS had a virus with distinct markings. There was one exception. As scientists looked at the original samples of bruise virus, which was the basis of the French test, and the virus which was used for Gallo's HTLV-3 test, they seemed to be remarkably similar. Studies of the DNA structure of the 2 viruses showed that, in fact, they have only a 1% difference in chemical composition. The normal difference is 30 or even 40%. This made it clear that the 2 labs had been using viruses which came from the same sample. An explanation for this, which immediately presents itself, is that Dr. Gallo's original samples had become contaminated by bruise virus. Contamination is a common problem in virology.
As the molecular biochemists started looking at it, they looked at the LAV isolate and the HTLV3 isolate by the actual gene sequence of the viruses, and not only showed that they were identical, but they were so identical that they looked like exactly the same isolate compared to other viruses that were taken from other specimens. And so then the question was, not only was the French virus and the American virus the same family of virus or the same subfamily or brothers and sisters, so it was the same cause of AIDS, but what was more shocking in this, they look like exactly out of the same test tube. And that's where the issue of, quote, contamination comes from in Bob Gallo's lab. So not only did he claim to have the cause of AIDS when he knew that the French had discovered it before, two, that he said his virus was different and it should be his name, HTLV3, it turns out that the actual very test tube isolate of virus that he has turns out to be the one the French sent him in the mail.
Dr. Gallo now accepts that the two viruses are the same, and that his test was in reality based on the French virus, and that it was probably a contamination. This raises the question of who really discovered the cause of AIDS. This question would probably have been examined in a court case over the patent assignment. But there never was a court case.
Well, the determination we finally came to after investigating it was that Bob Gallo, as strong as he was on his views, couldn't support the claims he was making from a legal standpoint. And so our attorneys recommended, the department attorneys, perhaps in some conflict with the NIH attorneys, recommended that we fold, that we roll over, but play it out until we saw how strong the French were on it. But our strategy was play it out as strong as we could, but if we got to the point where we knew we were going to court, that we should roll over, accept a reconciliation and settlement of this problem. The French attorneys, the attorneys representing the French government, didn't know how weak our case was, and they never discovered it. And so we were able to craft an agreement that probably disadvantaged the French, but it was because we hid our weakness fairly effectively.
We in the United States and France are very, very good and efficient scientists. And they will now work together and also create a foundation to fight against AIDS.
In 1987, President Ronald Reagan and the mayor of Paris, also a French presidential candidate, Jacques Chirac, ratified an agreement between the Institut Pasteur and the Department of Health.
We felt, in a political sense, that it was important for President Reagan to show that he had an interest in the AIDS problem. It was an inexpensive fix because it cost the government no money. Working out a deal with the French from a political standpoint was beneficial both to the French government, because their president was running for election. Reagan had a growing problem of insensitivity to people who had this affliction of AIDS. This offered a major advance in identifying people who would be afflicted by it and potentially offering the pathway for the discovery of a cure. And so we were pushing very hard to make sure that the president and that the French could come to a geopolitical press conference announcement to allow them to get the political benefits of it.
A week before the agreement, Gallo and Montagnier had met in a hotel room in Frankfurt. They had thrashed out between them an official history of the discovery of the virus. This was the basis of the agreement. The history gave equal credit to both institutions. Care was even taken that each institution and each team were mentioned an equal number of times. Few scientists would now question that the official history misrepresented the truth. But it still is the official history, and Professor Gallo and Professor Montagnier both signed it.
Well, of course, I had some thinking about that.